welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by an extremely accomplished and prolific writer of historical fiction. And the new book that I have just read that we are going to talk about is phenomenal. So let's hop right into it. Welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Absolutely. My name is Katherine Reay, and I think we should stop the interview right there. The book is phenomenal. I love it. So there we go. Nothing more needs to be said. But anyway, so the book is actually titled The Berlin Letters, and it is about a young woman who she works for a top secret CIA code breaking project, which is based on a real project called the Venona Project. She's part of a fictional one, Venona 2, and they are digging into old early Cold War communiques, and she stumbles across a symbol that reminds her of a childhood memory. And she soon discovers a cache of letters that imply that her father is still alive and in East Germany behind the Berlin Wall. This is the first week of November in 1989, and she impetuously drops everything, tries to form a plan, not a very successful one, to go over to East Berlin and break him out of jail. So it is a spy story, but it is also a love story. It is a family story. It is a story of hope, courage, just bravery, and the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall. So there's a lot of history in it, a lot of fun. It was a chase of a story. I loved writing it. So there you go.
You can tell reading it that you loved writing it, because I think it is just so exciting. And it's almost like, not that like the aim of historical fiction is to teach necessarily, but it felt like when you were in school and you had a teacher who was really enthusiastic about the content, and that was like your buy-in as well. So it is such a vividly told story, both in terms of the characters and the historical setting. But before we get into the book itself too much, I have a couple questions sort of about historical fiction and your writing process, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'm really curious about what draws you to a historical subject, and like what happens for you when you realize like, oh, this is not just something I'm interested in, but it is a new novel. Like what happens for you when you realize that?
It's interesting. For me, it's not necessarily the character or the journey that takes over. It's all the conflict. I am drawn to the conflict that's inherent in, say, in the London House, a British peer becoming an SOE agent, or in A Shadow in Moscow, two women with a very close relationship and sort of not knowing about each other, one deciding to spy for the CIA and one for MI6, and all the conflict inherent in that. And as I was researching that novel, of course, I came across the Berlin Wall. And there are some pictures, if you just Google them, there are pictures of the day the wall went up where it looks like a woman is handing her child over the barbed wire. And that struck me. What must that moment have been like? And so that kind of started the whole emotional conflict, et cetera, and the secrets that might be told so that the child doesn't really know, yeah, your mother passed you over a wall. How generationally that story is told. So that's how it started for me.
That is so interesting. And, it speaks to, I think, like the way that these really striking images can work in history, because I think they become popular because they present these little like humanizing moments, right? Like in historical events. But then they become so iconic that like the image takes over the people involved, if that makes sense, And so it's a really interesting project of like imbuing life back into this like larger than life moment,
Yeah, that's true.
So with this one, can you tell us a little bit about Louisa and Harris? And crafting their characters and the dual timelines. When you write dual timelines or more, as you have done, do you write them in communication with each other or separately and then interweave? Like, what does your process look like when you're structuring?
So briefly, Louisa is the main character of the novel, and her time period takes place only within that last week of the Berlin Wall. So November 3rd to November 9th. And it is her story. Harris's chapters intersperse about every fourth or fifth chapter, and he will take readers from the day the wall goes up until the day the wall comes down. So he covers a much broader time period. However, it is Louisa's emotions that drive the story. So I wrote Harris's, even though he skips many years in between and she's only working in days and hours, I wrote his chapters to parallel and augment the emotions she was going through at that time. So they're very closely written. They were written in sort of sequential order, because if I wrote them separately, I don't know that I'd have that emotional payoff between the two. A synergy wouldn't have been formed. So they absolutely were dovetailed the whole time together.
That's super interesting. Yeah, and they must, I guess, like almost like the characters, sort of enter into a dialogue and like kind of shape each other, as you get deeper into the story. Yeah.
Even though, she approaches the letters at the very beginning of the story, and then they kind of unfold. But you're right, there is this dialogue. What he's going through often on some level is the same conflict she's going through, but with a different subject. But yet the same sort of, I've been betrayed, or what do? I need to find allies, the same sort of issues they're both confronted with simultaneously.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit too about world building, especially because you are sort of building two worlds. You have Cold War Berlin and you have 1989, right? Present contemporary for the events of Louise's timeline. And I say this a lot on the show, but oftentimes when we talk of world building, we're talking about like fantasy or science fiction, but you also have to build real worlds, especially historical ones that like you can't access anymore. So could you talk about like, yeah, what goes into world building for you? And like, are those in dialogue too, the way that like the characters' journeys are?
Yes, absolutely they are. And world building for me, it started at the very beginning with just a ton of research. What were the forces that were playing within sort of the atmosphere within East Berlin? How did the people feel? And they felt very gray, by the way. and then I got to go to Berlin for 6 days, which really grounded everything. Like I understood from a map, you can tell that Stalin Alley, which then became Karl Marx Alley, runs straight into Alexanderplatz and the Fenesturium. Okay, great. But only until you've got feet on the ground do you realize that that was the centerpiece of Soviet architecture, that they made these huge buildings, and the Fenesturium 2 miles away is completely centered in the middle of the huge boulevard. And it's impressive. And so I didn't realize that sort of that emotional, like what the Soviet Union was doing, until I had feet on the ground there. And so that also adds to the world building. So a lot goes into it, but feet on the ground definitely helps. Reading a lot helped. But you're right, it is just like creating a fantasy world, in the sense that we cannot touch that world again. The wall came down in 89. Berlin will never be again what it was, but I do need to create for a modern day reader, many of whom may never have known the wall within their lifetime.
Yeah.
What that world was like. So.
That's so interesting. And like I think it speaks to the way that like historical fiction is kind of doing two things, because you're working with like history and things that appear in textbooks, like who did what and when, and like where this person traveled or who, whatever. But then you also have like the harder to recover part, which is like the lived in experience of history and people's like everyday lives, as opposed to just like the narratives of like great men doing things. So like when you research, what sort of sources do you look at to do that? Like you talk about feet on the ground and like your other stuff you read. Are you talking about like primary sources or secondary sources or a mixture of both or?
A little bit of both, a lot of primary and secondary. I also want to know what say the fiction was like in the 1980s about Berlin. How were fiction writers talking about it? So it's not even a primary or secondary. That's sort of, that ancillary source that actually creates a lot of tone too. But then while doing that, and your point is really, really astute, that there are events that happened, but it's how they affect people. Whenever I build that world or I put in those events, it is only to show how they emotionally affect the characters involved. Otherwise, I'm just giving you a research dump, and I really don't want to do that. I liken research to an iceberg. I got to do 100%. But that 10% on the top is all the reader will see. And they'll believe that 10% because the 90% underneath holds it up. But that 10% also has to directly correlate with the character's emotions. Otherwise, the reader's like, why did you give me that fact? And I never do that.
Yeah. Wow. That is such a great point that there is, and this is something that I sort of like faced. I am like what I call a recovering historian. Before I fell into libraries, I studied history. And, while you're doing research, you find all these little like tidbits that you want to include, like, oh, and these hard won bits, in a book that was really hard to get, or like going to a museum to visit something. And then you have to, it's a different form of like killing your darlings, right? You're like, oh, I worked so hard for this thing, but I can't,
I can't put it in. I cannot force feed it into the book. It's so true.
So talking about the historical context, which I guess is sort of funny after talking about, the lived in bits, but in terms of the research that you did about the CIA and Luis's sort of environment, that stuff is all super fascinating too. And the fact that like, I was not even super aware that like, that sort of cryptography was happening, like to this day. It felt like a very, like I thought that was like sort of, oh, earlier, like World War II cryptography, but I'm like, oh no, the process is still sort of like happening. So could you talk about, researching the CIA, especially given that it is like an institution that exists to keep secrets?
Yes,
And what that means for you. Yeah.
Okay, so I stumbled across an amazing book that really helped my sort of CIA very personal knowledge. It was by a woman named Amaryllis Fox, and it was called, I think, Coming of Age in the CIA, or I might have it somewhere, like Growing Up in the CIA, basically. And a first account tale of going to the farm and joining clandestine training, and the fact that there are a lot of CIA officers married to each other. That's where I got that fact. I thought that was super cool, and it made logical sense. If you come home at night, you want to share your secrets with someone who has clearance to hear your secrets. But anyway, okay, I've totally lost my thread. Oh, no, code breaking. You're absolutely right. So when I dealt with code breaking, obviously that was before the sort of computer age, and it is so much fun to talk with CIA, either officers or writers in today, because their world is so different, by the way. They've got all these gadgets and devices, and I've got, okay, a letter or something that was wound up within a pen. But yes, it does go on, because really we think of the CIA as James Bond and all of this daring do, and is it Ethan Hawke in Mission Impossible?
I think so, yeah. Oh, Ethan Hunt, yeah.
Hunt,
Yeah.
Ethan Hawke as an actor. Anyway, Ethan Hunt, but really it's a lot of preparation, a lot of analysis, a lot of the passing on information, the decoding of information, the all that kind of stuff, boring things. I mean, it would make for a really boring movie, but all of that stuff that Luis is working on in the book, and it still goes on today, just using super fast computers and tiny microchips.
It is a super interesting moment, I think, in history, because it's a moment at which, like, politics are super global, like in a way that is like only was enabled by the technology that had become available. But like it's still in a technological old world that is like more mechanical than like digital. You know, it's this really interesting transition between not only like power dynamics like on the global stage, but also in technology and how that affects people's lives and jobs. Like it's weaves so much together and it's so interesting.
It is. I mean, think about it. When the Berlin Wall went up, they cut telephone lines. I mean, we have so many different ways of communicating now, but they cut telephone lines and that was devastating. And all letters were censored. And then there's another thing I was thinking about when you're talking about that, just the different avenues in that I don't even know that you could do that today. Back then, they really were putting information into film canisters and journalists were crossing the wall with them and they were stopping radio waves or towers. You could, if you point, well, they were stopping them simply by arresting people who had their radio antennas facing west.
Wow.
But today, there's so many different ways that information gets around, as you say, a very global world. I just wonder what it would be like if you tried to create a physical wall. I don't know.
Yeah. We'll never know, I guess. Yeah. But yeah, there's just such an interesting time period. And I think it's also a very interesting choice to have a female protagonist, because like I think also when you're talking about Cold War history, like that is often told in geopolitical terms. And like, the stories of great men, as we've mentioned a couple times. And so to sort of fully restore a portrait of like the wide variety of people who were involved in these institutions is like a sort of an important act of restitution too.
The Venona project, which was incredibly powerful project. I mean, they uncovered some of the names like Alger Hiss and Carl Fuchs and the Rosenbergs and part of the Cambridge Five and Soviet infiltration to the Manhattan Project. They were primarily women, like predominantly women who were brilliant at math. And so we know some of those spy names, but we don't know the women's names who did that incredible work. And so your point is taken that those were primarily women doing extraordinary things.
For you, when you think about telling history stories through fiction, what is it that you feel like that you are accessing that like traditional modes of conveying history don't allow for?
I am first and foremost accessing that emotional human connection because I think not only, one could say history repeats itself. There's nothing new under the sun. You could say both of those things, but also we humans relate to each other through story, but also through experience and to tell stories of those experiences. And a lot of what Louisa goes through, any reader might say, I have felt those feelings of betrayal, those feelings of wanting to get up and go, those feelings that this fight matters more to me than anything else. And so they can step alongside and, be excited for Louisa or get courage for themselves, or there is a connection and history provides that, yes, but fiction provides that. I mean, that is how, not only do we connect, but we let truthiness kind of come in sideways beneath our defenses and we join into the story. And I love that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think about, what I think empathy does for us too, like when we're reading fiction. Because as a student of history, I remember, reading textbooks or even primary sources sometimes. And you're so used to just seeing names on a page that like you don't really aren't always making that mental connection that they are real people who lived, but then every once in a while you get like this little moment of vulnerability or if somebody like stepping outside their social role or doing something super unexpected or brave or weird, and it just like you connect in those moments.
Yeah, that is so true.
So I know it's not always easy for authors to talk about what is on the horizon, but you mentioned that you're working on something. Like, what does the future hold for you?
I am. Well, let's see. The beginning of my career, I wrote contemporary novels. So I wrote 7 contemporary novels and I loved that space. I loved talking about our time period and sort of wrestling with stuff within it. And then I got the bug for historical fiction, and I've written 3 now. The Berlin Letters is my 3rd sort of historical fiction spy novel, and that has been so fun. But now I'm going to move on to the world of art and art forgery. So
Oh,
the next book the one I'm writing about now will take place in 1973 London, and it surrounds an art forgery crime. So there you go. So it has a little bit of the sort of those spy chase, a little bit of suspense, a tiny bit of mystery, still sitting primarily in the historical fiction space, but it has those little bit of elements, but sort of leaving the spy world behind and going to the more visual world of art.
ooh, that's cool. I love that.
Really fun.
Is there a time period that you feel like you haven't gotten to explore yet that you would love to write about or, research?
Hmm. It's an interesting one because I am truly a one book at a time writer. And what I mean by that is I'm actually one full idea, world, everything at a time writer. So I can't say that there is one at the moment, but that doesn't mean that the moment I finish The Forger, I won't say, oh my goodness, 11th century, New Zealand is where I need to be. I have no idea.
Love
So,
that. That's exciting for us and for you, so that's great.
that's so interesting. And I don't know where I'll go next.
Cool. Well, I'm very excited to see this next project and whatever the future holds for you. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this one. And, if you want to come back and talk about art forgery when the time is right, you're always welcome back. So
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm so excited about the Berlin Letters, and I just really appreciate you helping me kind of spread the word and chat about it.
oh, it was a delight and an honor. Thank you. All right, so listeners, it is now your job. You're going to check out The Berlin Letters, a Cold War novel. By the time that you listen to this, it will be available out in the world. So please go to your favorite library or independent bookstore, wherever you like to go for those things. Thank you so much for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.